The White House has rejected the framing of the ongoing trade disputes between the U.S. and China as a war. Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Trade Representative, Peter Navarro, President Trump's key trade advisor, and Wilbur Ross, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, have all come forward in the past couple of days and justified Washington's trade actions against China.
When you're $500 billion down, this isn't a war you can lose if it gets to be a war. Have had a big problem with trade deficit for a long, long time.
We have a $375 billion trade deficit in goods with China. That is unsustainable. They're almost half of our total problem.
China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. They promised to play by the rules. They didn't. They grew from $1 trillion GDP to $12 trillion, and in the meantime, we lost 60,000 factories, over 5 million manufacturing jobs. That's on China.
The White House seemed to acknowledge that intellectual property and alleged technology transfers are just easy targets, while the Section 301 investigation is a weapon in America's trade toolbox. The ultimate goal here is to resolve the trade deficit and, more importantly, perhaps, to prevent China from challenging America's dominance in global economy. Some U.S. experts say this is Washington's tactics of scapegoating others for some of its own problems. Stephen Roach is professor at Yale University and author of a book, Unbalanced: The Codependency of U.S. and China. He argues that American households' consume now, pay later culture and savings shortfall explain much of America's deficit. Roach wrote, American politicians love to blame China and trade deals as the major source of pressure on U.S. jobs and wages. But when it comes to the trade deficits, the U.S. made its own bed. The country has been living beyond its means for decades and drawing freely on surplus saving from abroad to fund its greatest consumption binge in history. Politicians, of course, don't want to blame voters for their profligacy. It is much easier to point the finger at others. According to the World Bank and U.S. Federal Reserve, in 1970, U.S. household consumption was $666 billion. In 2017, that figure is $13.7 trillion, or nearly 70% of the GDP. The U.S. is 4% of the world's population, but consumes 22% of its goods. As America is buying more, they are doing so with borrowed money. U.S. family debt is 14% of disposable income in 1970. In 2017, U.S. family debt is 73% of disposable income. In the meanwhile, Americans borrow more and save less. The saving to GDP ratio dropped from 13% to just 2.6%. And if one looks at the deficit chart, this is where problems begin. In 1975, that was the last time the U.S. has seen a trade surplus. That said, deficit spending is not necessarily a bad thing, nor is America's trade deficit with China. Former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell spoke to CGTN a few years ago on this subject.
China, they send stuff to Walmart. Walmart sells it. The money goes back to China, and then China lends it to us to solve our deficit. It's a wonderful business cycle. Nobody's going to put that at risk. It benefits all parties.
Experts point out that throughout history, it's commonplace occurrence for countries going through industrialization to experience trade surplus. The U.S. has 93 years of trade surplus. Germany had 84 years of trade surplus starting in the 1880s. Japan witnessed a 30-year straight surplus from 1981 to 2010. And as China picked up pace in its industrialization process, surplus with the world, specifically with the U.S., began in the 1990s. Wang, CGTN, Washington.